In the first program, we've talked about the disadvantages of the system of thinking which most of us use. What would you put in its place?
Well, I am not trying to put something in place of our yes-no system, our ordinary thinking, which I think is highly effective. What I have suggested is putting as well, in addition, something which I call lateral thinking, for reasons I'll explain in a moment, putting this as well. And why I have suggested this is that I think our ordinary thinking system is highly effective, very effective, in the second stage of thinking. Once we have decided how we're going to look at the situation, what concepts we have chosen, what concepts we're going to use, then our ordinary thinking system is fine. But in the first stage of thinking, the way we look at a situation, if you like to call it the stage of perception, then our yes-no system is of practically no use at all. Because in the first stage, we've got to develop ideas, develop ways of looking at it, change ways of looking at it. We cannot decide this is right or that's wrong. It's an exploring stage, it's a creative stage, it's a generative stage. Once we have found out how to look at it, then we can use our logic to process those concepts.
What do you mean by the second stage, then?
Well, the second stage is, it's rather like having the chess pieces on the board. We know what they are, we know the rules, we move them around. The first stage is where you decide what game are we playing. Where you decide how to look at the situation. And this is why I call it lateral thinking, which implies moving sideways from one way of looking at a situation to developing, exploring other ways of looking at it. It has to do with chance and exploration and so on. It's rather like saying you cannot dig a hole in a different place by digging the same hole deeper. It may seem a very trivial thing to say, but in a lot of our thinking, we try to do precisely that.
Well, these really are two crucial phrases, vertical thinking and lateral thinking.
Yes.
I wonder if you can give me some examples of what you mean by
yes,
each of
I
these
think
things.
one has to give examples, otherwise it sort of stays around as an abstract philosophication, if there is such a word. And one has to illustrate it with examples. Let's go back to two of the stories, indeed three of the stories, of problems. One of them was a very simple one, coming back to the airport. There'd been a blizzard, car doors frozen, and the straightforward way is say, I need to heat this up, and you heat the key, and you put it in the lock, which unfreezes the lock, and you drive off. Perfectly straightforward, perfectly logical way of proceeding, which didn't work so well because there was a howling gale, and you couldn't light a lighter or breathe, and so on. But if you change the way of looking at it, and you change from saying, I need to heat this up, to saying, I need to unfreeze it, quite a small change in the way you're looking at it, quite a small change in concept. From that change, you can come to a very different solution, which in fact was to pour in some of the duty-free brandy which I'd bought on the plane, and that unfreezes it and immediately, and I drove off straight away. Now, clearly, I had to have known, like a lot of people do, that alcohol is a component in antifreeze and so on. So for me, that was an instance of lateral thinking. If you hadn't known that, you couldn't have used that. But there was a change in concept. Let's take the other problem I mentioned in the lane by my cottage at night. If you drive down nose first and you haven't space to turn, how do you get out if you haven't got reversing lights? As we saw before, you could say, let's put a torch on the ground or on the top of the car. Fine, perfectly straightforward way of solving it. But if you change your approach and you say, well, now, perhaps I do have lights, which I'm not looking at as lights, and all you need to do is you simply put on your direction indicator, which gives you flashing lights behind, which act as very good illumination.
Surely anybody hearing that story might say, yes, but this is only common sense.
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because any solution which you reach by lateral thinking or creativity and anything else, once you've got there, in hindsight, is always obvious. And it's very important to realize the difference between hindsight and foresight. I can give a problem to a room full of 100 people, and perhaps one or two will get the answer. The other 98, when the answer is pointed out to them, they will say, yes, of course, that's very obvious. So why didn't they get it in the first place? Simply because they were looking at it in the wrong way. Now, there's another story which I also use in my book, which I think sums it up very neatly, and this is the story of the merchant and the two pebbles. And the story is this merchant, he owed a lot of money to the moneylender. The moneylender came along one day to claim the money, and they were standing talking in the merchant's garden. And the moneylender said he wanted his money back, and the merchant explained that he couldn't possibly pay it. At this point, the moneylender noticed the merchant's beautiful daughter. And he said to the moneylender, he said, look, he said, if I can marry your daughter, I'll cancel your debt. But he said, I'm a fair man. He said, let's leave it to Providence to decide. I'm going to stoop down and I'm going to pick up from the path on which we're standing 2 pebbles, a black one and a white one. I'm going to put them in this bag. If your daughter picks out the white pebble, she stays with you and the debt is cancelled. If she picks out the black pebble, she marries me and the debt is cancelled. If she refuses to pick a pebble or anything else, then you pay the debt or go to jail. So they agreed to this and thought that 50% chance was better than nothing. But then the daughter noticed that as the moneylender stooped down to pick up the pebbles, he picked up 2 black pebbles and put them in the bag.
So she had no chance at all?
Well, she's faced with this situation. It seems a pretty closed situation. Now, what in fact she did do was this. She put her hand in the bag and she picked out a pebble. Without looking at it, she fumbled and dropped it on the path. And then she said, oh, how clumsy of me, but if you look at the colour of the one that is left, you will be able to tell the colour of the one I must have taken.
You call that lateral thinking. I call it a flash of genius.
Well, sometimes the 2 things are the same, not always. You can use lateral thinking and not get a right answer. Now, the point about this lateral thinking, this first stage of thinking, the way you start on a problem, the way you approach it, is extremely important. You probably know the story of the Irishman, and the couple motoring in Ireland stopped the roadside to ask the Irishman the way to Tipperary. And he hummed and hawed and he scratched his head a bit. And he said, well, look, he said, if I was going to Tipperary, I just wouldn't start from here. Now, obviously one accepts that as a typical Irishism, but really it's an extremely relevant story, because very often we set out to solve problems, but choose the wrong starting point. Now let's go back to the oil and vinegar problem. If you remember, a glass of oil, glass of vinegar, spoonful of oil into the glass of vinegar, stir it around, spoonful of the mixture back into the glass of oil, which is the most contaminated. Well, if you start by looking at it and say, well, you've exchanged pure oil for a mixture, therefore there's more oil in the vinegar glass, you will get an answer which is wrong. If you change your approach and you say simply that the volume in each glass is the same at the end as at the beginning, because you've taken out a spoonful but returned a spoonful, therefore anything in the oil glass which is not oil must be vinegar, and can only have come from the vinegar glass, and must have replaced an exactly equal amount of vinegar. Therefore, they must be the same in each. They're both equally contaminated. There is another way of looking at it, which shows you that some of the oil has done a round trip, and the bit which hasn't of oil and vinegar must be the same. Now, this is a very neat way of looking at it. I once gave this problem to a mathematician, and believe it or not, he gave me a whole piece of notepaper full of mathematical calculations to arrive at an answer which could be arrived at in one sentence by changing the way you look at it. And one of the great disadvantages of our scientific education at the moment is this tremendous fallacy that science simply consists in generating data. If you generate enough data, somehow that is going to give you ideas, which is an extremely wasteful way of proceeding. So in all our teaching, we teach scientists how to generate data, how to do experiments, how to assess experiments. And yet, at least 50% of science is in generating ideas, ways of looking at situations. And unfortunately, we haven't yet started to do this deliberately with science. So we are still on this very wasteful way. And on the other hand, in various fields, in government and industry, people are starting to realize that data and logic are not enough to solve problems. There's an idea ingredient, the way you look at it, which is extremely important.
So lateral thinking could be a synonym for having ideas?
Well, yes, except having ideas always makes it sound as if they're a luxury, that you can get along without ideas. I would rather say that it's got to do with the perception stage of thinking, the way you look at a situation or problem, and you can't get along without that. You can get along without extra luxury ideas, but you cannot get along without the perception stage.
In what way would you say the two types of thinking, the vertical and the lateral thinking, fundamentally differ?
Well, if I had to sort of really crystallize the point of difference, I'll do that first, and then I'll pick out some of the other points of difference. The real basis is this, that the vertical thinking, logical thinking, what I call the yes-no system, is based on judgment. That's the crucial operation, judgment. Lateral thinking is based on movement. That's the crucial operation, movement, from one idea to another, not judgment. Now, if I had to pick out these points of difference in rather more detail, I'll only pick out the points where the two systems really differ very profoundly. The first point is that lateral thinking is provocative, not analytical. For instance, in lateral thinking, there may not be a reason for saying something until after you have said it. Now,
That sounds Irish, too.
That may sound Irish, and in a logical system it's absolute nonsense. But in a lateral thinking, it may make a lot of sense. When you say something, you provoke the system, you provoke an idea which resets the system in a different way, and something makes sense. Of course, this is poetry. In poetry, there may not be a reason for putting words and phrases together until after you've done it, and it gives the effect. The second point, and this is a very crucial point of difference, that in logical thinking, you need to be right at each step. This is the very essence of logic, the basis of logic. Without it, logic would not exist. Yet in lateral thinking, you do not need to be right at each step. So this is another point of difference. The third point of difference is that in logical thinking, you concentrate on what is relevant, and you use what is relevant. In lateral thinking, you may welcome chance or even deliberately generate chance intrusions in order to give you a different entry point, a different way of looking at it. In logical thinking, you accept and you seek and accept the best way, the right way of doing things. In lateral thinking, you deliberately seek alternatives, even if they are less likely than the best one. Finally, in logical thinking, you proceed in sequence from one statement or one idea to another, step by step. In lateral thinking, you may make quite big jumps to a different point and then work backwards, or big jumps and work forwards, and gradually let ideas coalesce. Now, as I said in the beginning, and I really want to stress this because people usually get it wrong, what I'm suggesting with lateral thinking is not instead of logical thinking. It's as well. But it's the sort of thinking which we need in the first stage, the perception stage, the way of looking at a situation, where logic is inadequate. And if we insist on only using logical thinking, then we can only use the ready-made concepts which we have acquired through our culture or developed, and we cannot generate new ones. And yet lots of problems are difficult to solve, not because our thinking is inadequate, but because our concepts or our approach is inadequate. So the two are complementary. Now, in the next program, we'll move on to look at a word, a new word, an invented word, which is as basic to lateral thinking as the word know is to logical thinking. For instance, let's look at a problem. Let's look at the problem of pollution. Long rivers, factory putting out muck into the river, people downstream suffering from it. What could one do about this, shall we say, in terms of legislating to prevent it, apart from just saying don't do it? Now, in lateral thinking, you might put in, as a stepping stone, the rather ridiculous idea that factories should be downstream of themselves. It sounds pretty daft, because how can a factory be there and downstream of itself at the same time? Yet in lateral thinking, which doesn't use the yes-no, right-wrong system, this makes good sense, and we'll see how we can go from it to an idea which is a very simple and straightforward idea. But listeners can think out for themselves what they might do about that pollution problem.